If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The Drunk Savior. I remember every detail of that night because I've never felt fear quite like it. It was late, just after 11 p.m., and I was walking home from a friend's place a few blocks away. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that feels unnatural in a city, where there's usually some background noise, even late at night. As I passed the corner convenience store, I noticed a man standing near the entrance, swaying slightly. He was middle-aged, wearing a tattered hoodie, and holding a brown paper bag with what was obviously a bottle inside. I kept my head down, hoping to avoid any interaction, but as I walked by, he called out, "Hey, you shouldn't be walking alone at night." His voice was slurred, but there was an urgency in his tone that made me glance back. He was already moving toward me. At first, I thought he was just being annoying, like some random drunk guy who didn't know how to mind his business. I picked up my pace, but he matched it, staying just a few steps behind. "I'm just trying to help," he said, louder this time. "It's dangerous out here." His words didn't feel comforting. They felt like a warning, but not the kind you'd get from someone genuinely concerned. I muttered something like, "I'm fine, thanks," and kept walking. But he didn't stop. Instead, he started listing reasons why he needed to walk me home. "It's not safe for women, you know. Guys like me, we make sure nothing bad happens." My stomach tightened. Something about the way he said, "guys like me," sent a chill down my spine. I thought about ducking into a store or turning down a busier street, but there wasn't anywhere nearby that felt safe. It was just me and this guy in the quiet, dimly lit neighborhood. He kept talking, getting louder and more insistent, but his words didn't make any sense. "I know what happens out here," he mumbled. "I've seen things. You need someone like me." His footsteps sounded heavier as he got closer, and I felt his presence looming just behind me. My heart was pounding, and I started calculating how far I was from home. 2 more blocks. Just 2. I kept telling myself that if I stayed calm and didn't provoke him, he'd get bored or distracted. But the closer I got to my building, the clearer it became that he had no intention of stopping. When I finally turned onto my street, I thought about making a run for it. But I didn't want him to know where I lived. The last thing I needed was this guy figuring out where I slept at night. I stopped abruptly, hoping he'd pass me or get tired of the game, but instead, he froze too, swaying just a few feet away. His eyes looked glassy, but there was something sharp in the way he stared at me. "You don't get it," he said, almost whispering now. "They're out here. I'm the only one who can stop them." My stomach sank, and I felt a wave of nausea. Who was they? What was he talking about? Before I could process it, he started laughing, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I glanced around, hoping for anyone, literally anyone, who could help. But the street was empty, and the nearest light was flickering, casting weird shadows on the pavement. "Look," I said, trying to sound firm, though my voice shook. "I don't need your help. Just go home." For a second, I thought he might listen. He stopped laughing and tilted his head, like he was actually considering it. But then he took a step closer, and I could smell the alcohol on him. No, you don't get it," he said, almost pleading now. "They'll take you if I don't stay. I've seen them do it before." His words made no sense, but his intensity felt real. Too real. It wasn't the kind of thing you could just brush off as a drunk rant. I started backing away, keeping my eyes on him, my hand in my pocket gripping my keys like a makeshift weapon. He didn't move for a moment, just stood there staring at me with this strange mix of desperation and, what? Regret, fear. Then, without warning, he lurched forward, and I panicked. I bolted down the street, sprinting toward the first open doorway I could find. It was a laundromat, brightly lit and thankfully still open. The attendant looked up, startled, as I burst in, out of breath and trembling. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see him right behind me, but the street was empty. He was gone, just like that. I stayed in the laundromat for what felt like an eternity, pretending to look at my phone while my hands shook uncontrollably. The attendant must have noticed how rattled I was because he kept glancing over but didn't say anything. I thought about calling someone, but who? The police? What would I even tell them? Some drunk guy followed me and talked about, what, monsters? It sounded insane, even to me. After about 15 minutes, I peeked out the window. The street was still deserted, and I decided to make a run for it. My apartment was just a block away, and the adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by sheer exhaustion. When I finally got home and locked the door behind me, I collapsed onto the couch, trying to calm down. But the fear didn't fade, it only got worse. I couldn't stop replaying his words. They'll take you if I don't stay. What did he mean? Who was they? And why did he seem so convinced he was protecting me? I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and shadow, half expecting him to somehow show up outside my window. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just a random encounter with a delusional drunk guy. But then I overheard something a few days later that made my blood run cold. A woman at the cafe down the street was telling her friend about a similar experience. A man following her home, drunk, insisting he had to protect her. She described him perfectly. It was the same guy. Hearing her story made my stomach drop. She said he'd been rambling about keeping her safe and watching out for them. The details were eerily similar. His slurred speech, his ragged hoodie, even the way he'd stopped and stared at her like he was seeing something she couldn't. The only difference was that she managed to lose him after ducking into a crowded bar. I wanted to jump into their conversation and ask her more, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Just hearing it was enough to confirm that this wasn't some isolated incident. He'd done this before, maybe more than once. And that realization made my skin crawl. What was he actually trying to do? Protect us? Or was that just some weird excuse to stalk women at night? For days, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I walked down my street, I half expected to see him again. I even started taking different routes home, staying on well-lit streets with people around, just in case. But the part that really gets me, the part one can't shake, is the way he spoke. He didn't just sound drunk. He sounded convinced. Like he truly believed what he was saying. I keep asking myself, was he just a harmless lunatic, or was there something more to it? Something I'm better off not knowing? I haven't seen him since, but every time I'm alone at night, I can't help but feel like someone's watching. Like maybe he wasn't as crazy as he seemed. I finally decided to dig a little deeper, though I wasn't sure what I was even looking for. I posted a vague description of my encounter in a local community forum, asking if anyone else had experienced something similar. Within hours, a few people responded. Most of the replies were just concerned neighbors offering advice. Don't walk alone, carry pepper spray, the usual. But one comment stood out. Someone wrote, if it's the same guy I've seen around, he's been doing this for years. Always drunk, always mumbling about them. He followed my sister a while back but disappeared before she could call anyone. My heart sank as I read it. Years. How had no one stopped him? And what was his deal with them? That comment stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I started to wonder if there was some truth to what he'd been saying, not about monsters or whatever, but about danger. Maybe he'd seen something, Or maybe he'd been through something that broke him. The scariest part is that I'll probably never know. I haven't seen him again, and no one else I've talked to has either. It's like he just vanished. But sometimes, late at night when the streets are quiet and the shadows stretch long, I hear his voice in my head. They're out here. And I wonder, was he really drunk? Or did he know something the rest of us don't? I hate that I'll never have an answer. But maybe that's for the best. The Tweaker Intruder. Back in 2016, I was 29 years old and raising my 5-year-old son, Liam, on my own. We had just moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Portland. It wasn't much, but it was cozy, and it felt like a fresh start after a tough year. I worked evenings as a waitress at a diner downtown, so most nights I'd get home around 11, exhausted but relieved to see Liam sleeping soundly in his bed. My neighbor, an older lady named Marcy, would babysit for me, and she adored Liam. That night, though, Marcy had called in sick, and I'd managed to get off early to tuck him in myself. The walk home from the bus stop was usually uneventful, just a quiet trek through dimly lit streets with the occasional passing car. I always kept my keys in my hand, just in case. That night, I noticed a man lingering near the corner of my block. He was pacing, muttering to himself, and every now and then he'd let out this unsettling laugh, loud and abrupt. I didn't recognize him, but something about the way he kept glancing up and down the street put me on edge. I quickened my pace, clutching my bag tighter, and prayed he wouldn't notice me. As I walked past him, I kept my head down, pretending not to see him, but I could feel his eyes on me. Just as I was about to turn the corner to my building, I heard his footsteps start up behind me. At first, they were slow, almost hesitant, but then they picked up speed. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't dare look back. My building was just a few steps away, and I fumbled with my keys as I reached the front door, trying not to drop them. I barely got inside and shut the door behind me before I heard him slam into it from the other side. He started pounding on the glass, yelling something I couldn't make out. His voice was slurred, erratic. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. I could see him through the window, his face pressed up against the glass, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He was grinning, but it wasn't a normal grin. It was wide and manic, like he thought this was all some kind of game. I sprinted up the stairs to my apartment, trying to stay quiet, hoping he'd lose interest if he thought I'd disappeared. My dog, Charlie, a German Shepherd mix, was waiting at the door when I got in. Usually, he was calm and happy to see me, but tonight his hackles were up, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. That was when I heard it, the sound of the building's front door opening. He'd somehow forced his way inside. I locked my apartment door and backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. My phone was in my bag, but my hands were shaking too much to dial 911. Instead, I grabbed Liam's baseball bat from the closet and stood there in the dark, listening to the heavy thud of boots climbing the stairs. Every step made the floorboards creak, and it felt like the sound was drilling into my brain. Charlie was by my side, his growl growing louder with every step the man took. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. For a moment, everything went silent, except for Charlie's growling. Then came the sound of the doorknob rattling, followed by a hard bang as the man threw his weight against the door. I felt like my heart was going to explode. I tightened my grip on the bat, whispering "Stay" to Charlie, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to calm him or myself. Liam was still asleep in his room, completely unaware of the danger just feet away. The door frame groaned under the pressure, and then, with a deafening crack, the lock gave way. The door swung open, and there he was, his wiry frame silhouetted in the hallway light. His face was twisted with a kind of desperation that made my stomach drop. He stumbled inside, mumbling incoherently, but as soon as his eyes landed on me, they lit up with something between recognition and madness. That was when Charlie launched himself at him, teeth bared, barking so ferociously it echoed through the entire apartment. Charlie collided with him like a freight train, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing to the floor. The man screamed, this guttural, panicked sound that sent chills down my spine. Charlie was relentless, snapping and barking, his teeth flashing as he pinned the guy down. For a split second, I just stood there, frozen, watching the chaos unfold. Then I snapped out of it and grabbed my phone, finally managing to dial 911 with trembling fingers. As I was talking to the operator, the man started thrashing wildly, trying to push Charlie off. His movements were jerky, frantic, and I could see his face contorting in fear and pain. "Call off your dog," he yelled, his voice cracking. But I didn't dare call Charlie back. If anything, I was praying he'd keep the guy pinned until the cops arrived. I told the dispatcher everything, my words coming out in a rush, and she assured me that officers were already on their way. The minutes stretched on like hours as I waited for the police, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. Charlie was still on top of the man, his teeth inches from the guy's throat, barking and snarling every time he tried to move. The man was yelling now, his voice hoarse and slurred, screaming nonsense about someone chasing him. He reeked of sweat and something chemical, like gasoline or paint thinner. It hit me then, he was high on something, completely out of his mind. I heard the wail of sirens in the distance, and relief washed over me, but the man must have heard them too. He twisted violently, managing to shove Charlie just enough to scramble to his feet. I screamed, gripping the bat tighter, but Charlie was faster. He lunged again, sinking his teeth into the guy's arm and dragging him back down with a force that made my stomach churn. The man's screams turned into a horrible mix of anger and pain as he flailed helplessly beneath my dog. Moments later, the red and blue lights of the police cars lit up my apartment through the windows. I could hear officers shouting from the hallway, their heavy boots pounding up the stairs. "He's in here," I yelled, my voice shaking. Charlie was still on him, growling and holding his arm in a vice-like grip. When the officers burst through the door, guns drawn, it was like the air shifted. One of them called out, commanding the man to stop resisting, while another barked at me to get Charlie under control. I grabbed Charlie's collar, pulling him back as gently as I could. His teeth were bloodied, his eyes locked on the intruder like he was ready for round two. The man tried to get up, but the cops were on him in seconds, pinning him to the ground and cuffing him. As they hauled him to his feet, I saw his face more clearly, sweat-soaked, with hollowed cheeks and a glazed look in his eyes. He kept muttering under his breath, something about needing to find it. It made no sense, but the crazed desperation in his voice sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Once the man was out of my apartment, one of the officers stayed behind to take my statement while the others escorted him downstairs. Charlie sat at my feet, still tense, his eyes fixed on the door as if he expected the man to come back. I stroked his head, my hands trembling, and tried to piece together what had just happened. The officer asked if I'd ever seen the guy before, if he'd followed me home. I told him everything, from the moment I saw him on the corner to the terrifying sound of my door being forced open. After the officers left, I locked every possible entrance to the apartment and collapsed on the couch with Charlie. My mind was racing, replaying the night over and over, trying to make sense of it. Why had he picked my building? My door? There was no rhyme or reason to it. It was just chaos, the randomness of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Liam never even woke up, thank God, and I sat there for hours, watching him sleep, feeling grateful and terrified all at once. The next day, the officer called to let me know they'd identified the guy. He was a homeless man with a long record of drug-related arrests and mental health issues. They didn't think he'd targeted me specifically. He was just in a drug-fueled haze, looking for somewhere to hide. It didn't make me feel much better. 4 weeks after that, I jumped at every sound, every creak of the floorboards, But I knew one thing for sure: Charlie had saved us. If it weren't for him, I don't know how that night would have ended. The Tube Encounter. I take the same route home every evening, the Jubilee line from Canary Wharf to Stratford. It's always the same routine: earbuds in, audiobook on, and my gaze fixed somewhere vague to avoid eye contact. That evening wasn't supposed to be any different. The train wasn't crowded. Maybe half the seats were filled, a mix of tired commuters, students, and a couple of tourists clutching oversized maps. He got on at Canada Water. I wouldn't have even noticed him if he hadn't been muttering under his breath as he walked into the carriage. He was maybe mid-40s, disheveled, with wild, greasy hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His jacket was too big for him, hanging awkwardly off his thin frame, and his hands were filthy. The muttering was unintelligible at first, but it was loud enough that people started shifting uncomfortably. At first, I figured he was just another person having a rough time. London's full of them. But as the train pulled away, his muttering turned into this weird, rhythmic chant. It wasn't any language I recognized. More like he was just stringing together nonsense syllables in a sing-song voice. A few passengers were trying not to look at him, but he was hard to ignore. He wasn't sitting. He stood by the doors, swaying slightly as the train moved, staring at the floor. Then he suddenly stopped chanting and started laughing, a high-pitched, unnatural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the kind of laugh you hear when someone finds something funny. It was like he was trying to scare us. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it started, and that's when he looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, wide, and darting around the carriage like he was searching for someone, or something. He locked eyes with me for a second, and I swear my stomach dropped. There was this intensity in his stare, like he wasn't looking at me but through me. I quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in my phone, but I could still feel his gaze. My hands started shaking, and I couldn't bring myself to glance back. That's when he started pacing, moving unsteadily down the aisle, brushing past people's knees. I could hear him muttering again, but it was more aggressive now, like he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. When he reached the middle of the carriage, he suddenly slapped the pole next to him, hard enough to make a loud clang. Everyone jumped. "You think I don't see you?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. A few people shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable, but no one said a word. Londoners are pros at ignoring weirdos on the tube, but this felt different. His voice got louder, almost manic, as he started ranting about people spying on him, accusing us of being in on it. He pointed randomly at a man in a suit, then at a woman holding a shopping bag. "You're all watching me. You think I don't know?" he bellowed. At that point, the atmosphere in the carriage changed. You could feel the tension, this shared fear creeping in as everyone realized this wasn't just some drunk rambling. The train slowed as we approached Canada Water, and I prayed he'd get off. A few people were glancing nervously toward the door, probably thinking the same thing. But when the doors opened, he stayed put, glaring at the platform like he was daring someone to approach him. Then, just as the train started moving again, he stomped his foot so hard it echoed through the carriage, and everyone flinched. "You can't escape," he screamed, and that's when I noticed his hands. They were smeared with something dark, almost black in the dim light. At first, I thought it was dirt, but as he rubbed his palms together, it smeared too easily. It was blood. A woman across from him gasped audibly, and he whipped around to face her. "What?" he snarled, taking a step closer to her. She recoiled, clutching her bag to her chest. He didn't touch her, but his presence was so threatening that I could see her shaking. My heart was pounding. I kept glancing toward the emergency alarm but couldn't move. No one could. It was like we were frozen, waiting for him to snap further. He started pacing again, muttering to himself, wiping his bloody hands on his jacket. It left these grotesque streaks of red on the already filthy fabric. As we pulled into Canary Wharf, I was hoping, practically begging, that someone on the platform would notice what was happening and step in. Maybe security, maybe a bystander. But when the doors slid open, he stood right in the center, blocking anyone from getting on. A few people glanced inside, saw him, and immediately turned away, deciding to wait for the next train. He started laughing again, that same eerie, unnatural laugh, and smeared his bloody hands on the glass doors as they closed. "No one's coming for you," he muttered, his voice lower now but somehow more chilling. I was gripping the edge of my seat so hard my knuckles were white. That's when I realized the guy next to me was doing the same. We exchanged a brief look, this unspoken acknowledgement that we were both terrified. The man started ranting again, but his voice shifted. It was almost pleading now, like he was arguing with something only he could see. "You promised! You promised!" he shouted, slamming his hand against his own chest. Then suddenly he turned toward the window, as if something outside had caught his attention. He pressed his face to the glass, whispering something I couldn't make out. For a brief moment, the rest of us exhaled, thinking maybe his attention had shifted for good. But the relief didn't last. Without warning, he spun around and threw himself to the floor of the carriage. It was so abrupt that a woman in the corner screamed, and a man near the door jumped up, pressing his back against the wall. The guy on the floor started writhing, his hands clawing at the air like he was trying to fight something invisible. He was mumbling again, but the words were incoherent, almost guttural. Then, he began to scratch at his face, his nails leaving red trails down his cheeks. The sight was horrifying, but no one moved. We were all paralyzed, too afraid to act. The train jolted as it approached North Greenwich, and for a split second, I thought he'd hurt himself from the movement. But he sprang up like nothing had happened, standing stock still in the center of the aisle. His chest was heaving, and there was blood smeared not just on his hands now, but on his face and neck. His eyes looked wild, almost animalistic. Then he turned to the rest of us and said, in this strange, calm voice, "It's too late. You've already seen it." No one dared to respond, but his words sent a chill through the carriage. Seen what? What was he talking about? The train pulled into North Greenwich, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like time had stopped. The doors slid open, and a few people bolted out of the carriage without looking back. I wanted to do the same, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. He didn't move. He stood there, bloodied and swaying slightly, staring at the people who had just left. Then, as the doors started to close, he let out this deep, guttural growl, low and menacing. The sound didn't even seem human. A man near the emergency alarm finally snapped out of it and pulled the lever, but the train was already moving. As the announcement blared that the train would stop at the next station, the man started pacing again, dragging his hands along the walls, leaving bloody smears on the metal. "You can't run," he hissed, his voice sharp and venomous. "None of you can." His words felt like a physical weight pressing on my chest. People were looking at each other, silently begging someone to do something, but no one moved. I felt this overwhelming urge to scream, to cry, but I stayed frozen, staring at the floor. He finally stopped pacing and looked at us one by one, his eyes locking onto each person like he was memorizing our faces. The train slowed as it approached Canning Town, and I've never been so desperate to get off. The moment the doors opened, nearly everyone bolted for the platform. I stumbled out, barely registering the other passengers around me, just needing to get as far from that carriage as possible. But when I turned to look back, God knows why I looked back, he was still there. He hadn't moved. He stood by the door, staring out at the platform with this eerie calmness. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass, leaving a smeared print as the doors closed. The train pulled away, and he disappeared into the tunnel, taking that suffocating energy with him. I stood there on the platform, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Around me, people were whispering, their faces pale, but no one seemed to know what to do. I wanted to report it, to tell someone, but what would I even say? That a man covered in blood acted bizarrely on a train? It didn't feel like enough, not for what we'd just experienced. Even now, I can't explain what happened, or why. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear that laugh again in my head, and I wonder if anyone else on that train does too.